So thanks for the introduction. Thanks for allowing me to talk today. I suppose the first talk is somewhat motivational in problem space, what problems we have at Los Alamos and how storage can help us. I'll talk a little bit about that. This is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what we do, so if you think we're not interested in something you're working on, you're probably wrong. Hit us up about anything you've got, and likely we've seen it or use it or want to use it. So, but I'll be talking today about computational storage and a journey we've been going through for the last several years. Some people may think computational storage is dead. I hope that's not really the case. I think it got a little bit of a bad rap and a bad start. We still think we've got some killer apps for it, and hopefully other organizations do too, so I'll just dive right in. So computational storage, why? So data gravity for us is an important consideration, and when I start talking about some of our applications and how they work, I think you'll agree that that's probably the case. And because of that, we really need flexibility for where computation is done. Computation can be done, of course, in the computer or in GPUs, CPUs, and all the PUs, and there's a lot of them now, aren't there? But doing some computation in the network and computation in your storage makes some sense, mostly because of opportunistic things and very large-scale computing, and because economics change over time, and where it's economical to do a particular piece of the computational job you're trying to accomplish can change and move around over time just because of economics. And it's not just about saving energy, pushing the computation near the storage. That's part of it. It's not just about making it go faster. That's part of it. But for me, I have machines that have many petabytes of DRAM, and when they write out data, they write out many petabytes of DRAM onto data sets, and moving those data sets around is expensive. But if I were going to do data analytics on the data that I produce, I would need a same size machine that produced the data to consume the data. And so I would need to buy another petabyte size machine just to do the analytics on it. But if I could do some reductions near the storage, maybe I don't need another petabyte machine, and I really don't want another petabyte machine. So anyway, it could save me in actual capital dollars if it works. We've done two sorts of offloads. One, data agnostic, and that's sort of like compression, erasure, encoding, things like that, where you don't have to understand what the data is or the format or the layout or anything like that. And then there's data aware offloads, where you do have to understand the layout of the data and the types and things like that. And in our world, analytics sometimes can read what it really wants is a small fraction of the data that we actually produce. And so finding that is actually the hard part. So the question we asked ourselves a number of years ago is, could we do a little bit of indexing of data as it's written to make finding what we're looking for easier? And that turned out to be a little bit bigger problem than we thought it was going to be. So I'll talk about multiple different kinds of methods. Particle methods. Particle methods are where you've got a fixed grid and particles float around in the grid. We use that for all kinds of things in simulation land, but those methods are generally called particle methods. There's grid methods, which are different. That's a grid again, but things don't float around between them. There's no particles involved. Each grid point has values, pressure, temperature, materials properties, and things like that. And those pressures and temperatures and materials properties change. So the values are associated with the cells themselves. In a point method, the values are associated with the particles, and the cell ID is just where it's at. And then we have large complex models that use all kinds of methods, and how we're going to solve those problems it's unclear yet. So the first thing we did was this data agnostic offload. Why did we do a data agnostic offload? Well, we move a lot of data, right? If every data set I produce is a petabyte and I have to move one every 5 minutes, I move a lot of data in a day. So I need networks that run at many, many terabytes a second, very high, wide parallelism to do that. And And we, when you're building a system like this, you're buying an awful lot of servers to move data. And it got to the point to where we needed a server where a server couldn't even keep up with a NIC that wasn't, so we could put a NIC in, we'd do a server, the server had to pass over the data 3 or 4 or 5 times to do compression and do erasure and do encoding and all of those things. And that means you're passing over the data 5 times, right? One to read it in off the net, one to compress it, one to erase it, one to encode it, and one to write it out to the storage device. So you need 5 times the amount of memory bandwidth in a server than the NIC. And that wasn't true, and still kind of isn't. If you go add it up, the NICs are faster than the machine because of the number of passes over the data you have to make. And so we looked and said, is that going to change? And it turns out it has changed. It changed partially because of me. I wrote a very large check to Intel to get them to build Sapphire Rapids with HBM, which gave us a 5 times bump in memory bandwidth. But that's a one-time thing. That's not ever going to happen again. And so we felt like we needed to do something about it, offloading some of that, offloading some of the compression, offloading the erasure, offloading the whatever. And this is not new. Intel's had QAT technology for years and years and years that this sort of, works. So now it's even in their chip. But we wanted to offload it in such a way that it was agnostic. It wasn't associated with anybody's processor. It wasn't associated with, anything really. Open source. Part of an open source project, potentially, anybody can use it. The data written is the same as if the data would be written by software if you offload it. So in case your device fails that you're offloading to, you can still read the data back the way you wanted to read it back, so you don't fail. The failovers just go back to software and so forth. And so we put this project together where we offloaded erasure, encoding, and compression from OpenZFS. We have ZFS developers, on the payroll, and the idea was let's take some of the memory bandwidth heavy things and offload it to another a device, an FPGA or whatever. So we worked with a team of companies. You can see the companies we work with there, very good partners, and we built an offload library for ZFS, and actually a plug-in in the kernel so that you could register, hey, I'm great at erasure, send your erasure to me, and that sort of thing. And then there's a plug-in that goes into ZFS that makes this happen within OpenZFS, which actually enables QAT as well as other kinds of offloads. And to do this, we said we should break the block-oriented way of thinking about this when we offload, and we should do some more of a distributed programming model between, the ZFS and the kernel and the offload device. So what you see here is, the top box is, the normal way you go through a ZFS. You compress and then you checksum and so forth over the data. In the case of what we did is you basically, you allocate memory on the accelerator, you copy the memory to the accelerator, then you tell the accelerator, compress that in your memory. Don't send it back to me, just compress it. And then tell me when you're done, and I'll go about my merry way, and 6 weeks later in processor time, I'll tell you, okay, you're done with that, go ahead and erase it or checksum it or whatever, and so forth. And the same, so you go through the same process, but you're telling the accelerator to offload this stuff all basically in a pipeline. And then even writing the data out, it doesn't go back to the host. It uses NVMe peer, and it just says, oh, well, that was destined to go into these blocks on this storage device. I'm just going to put it there for you. And again, the nice thing about this is the bytes you write are the same bytes you have written if you just use software. So if this thing fails, you can still read your data back. So anyway, this is all open source. It's available. It's kind of neat. The reason we did it is because of the pathetic server memory bandwidth that you can buy. And it did offload the entire thing, and we can run at full device rates almost no matter what compression you do, which is kind of nifty. So if anybody that's run ZFS and they turn on all this fancy stuff knows that it slows way down, and there's a way to not do that, and this is how you do it. So that was data aware, data agnostic. Now we go to data aware. And the first thing we tried with data aware is row-based offloads. So row-based offloads, again, are associated with these grid methods. these point methods. And the point methods that we chose a code called VPIC, a particle in cell code, particles floating around in cells. And our problem looks like this. It's got about 1 million cells spread out over about 1 million core, it's got about 1 million cells spread out over about 100,000 cores or something. And it's got 1 trillion particles that are floating around in these 1 million cells. And so you've got all these nodes, 10,000 nodes that you've got this thing spread across, and the cells flow around in this big plasma. And what the user wanted to do was the user wanted to know the state of every particle at every time step. So this particle moves around, and then you take a snapshot of it because it's moved and the energy's changed on it and the momentum's changed on it. So you write down 1 trillion records, what's the state of all these particles, and then you run physics for a little while, and then you write it down again because it's all moved, and then you write it down again. And so each one of these is a petabyte. They probably do 10,000 time steps. What's 10,000 petabytes? It's a big ass number, 10 exabytes. This is what I do, so I don't care about the numbers. Zeros don't matter anymore. And the user said, well, what I really want to know is at the end of the simulation, there are going to be 1,000 of these trillion particles that are super interesting to me. And I want you to tell me where those particles have been, through all these time steps. And so we said, well, the user said, well, I want to write a file per particle per time step. And we thought about that and said, well, I don't know, that's 1 trillion files times 10,000 time steps. I'm not sure there's a file system that will do that. I don't know, maybe there's one that's being built that would do that, but it's a tall order. And so we said, why don't we just make you think you're writing a file, but instead you're writing a record into a key value store. And why don't we run 10,000 key value stores in parallel and shard on the particle ID so it is incredibly scalable. And you write your particles out to this thing, and it's just a key value, and it's sharded on particle ID. So at the end, when you have your fancy 1,000 particles that you think are really cool, just tell us the IDs, and we'll go get them for you, and we can go get them without reading very much data. In fact, without very much data at all. 6 to 7 orders of magnitude less data you read than you wrote. This is pretty typical in science. You're always looking for a needle in a haystack, right? So the user was happy, right? Instead of reading back a petabyte, he got to read back these records are small, 50 bytes, 1,050 bytes versus a petabyte. It's a big deal. And so this was a huge win. We worked with SK Hynix and Carnegie Mellon on this. It was a best paper, student paper at Supercomputing about this a few years ago, but it's pretty cool stuff. And it's basically pretty consumable. The API more or less looks like ROX. It runs 10,000 copies of ROX in parallel and just works. With SK Hynix, we pushed this stuff down into hardware, which was kind of neat, and we showed a benefit there. Columnar. So we move on to columnar. This is where, for our grid methods, again, grid methods don't have these particles that float around. They just have cells. There's lots of cells, trillions of cells. And the physics that runs on these cells, it basically changes the values inside the cells as the physics run, and you take snapshots of the state of the cells. So instead of taking snapshots of the state of the particles, you take snapshots of the state of the cells. And what we were trying to do is we were trying to track a shockwave going through a material. So you got a big old C, big old, volume that you're running a shockwave through, and the shockwave moves, and so as the shockwave moves, you want to track where that shockwave is, and so we have codes that do that, so we chose a code that sort of does that, and that's the application we chose to use. Our first try at this was with Seagate. We partnered with Seagate, and they had the old kinetic thing, which Jim Hughes and I actually invented at a MSST conference in 24 years ago or something. I was on the Queen Mary. You remember that one? And so, anyway, we basically said, let's write Parquet files out with the states of all of these cells. Millions of Parquet files, each one with, say 1 million records in it or something like that. You get to 1 trillion. And let's make that format known to to the drive, to the processor on the drive, and we can push the query down to the processor on the drive. The processor on the drive can do standard Parquet query. If you guys aren't familiar with what that is, the Parquet files are columnar files that have little indexes for each row group and interesting stuff like that, so that you can pull data out of them pretty efficiently. It's from the Apache ecosystem for analytics. So anyway, we ran this problem, and it worked pretty darn well. In fact, what we found is that the little processor, 2-core ARM on the Seagate drive, could actually query it faster than the host, because it had a little bit more bandwidth between the processor and the host than to the drive, as opposed to all the way back to the host. So it worked pretty well, but it wasn't very consumable. And so we said, this is pretty cool, this is interesting, let's move forward with this idea of columnar, and let's learn from what we've done. And so what we've learned is, computational storage arrays are good for certain things like erasure and compression. Computational storage devices seem to be pretty good at reductions. Making what you do very consumable is very important. So in this case, it's making it consumable by the Apache ecosystem, and so forth. So I won't bore you with that. On to the science. So this is a simulation, and each one of those things is a time step, and each one of those things is a time step, and so those are the cells. And you can see that the cells aren't all the same size. The cells aren't all the same size for a very important reason. It's because the fun stuff is happening there. There's no reason to resolve this stuff very finely out here, when all you really need to do is resolve where the fun stuff is. This is called adaptive mesh refinement, and this is how you run science problems, because you could never buy a machine big enough to run a science problem on. And you might say, well, my gosh, Gary, you have machines that have petabytes of DRAM. How damn big of a machine do you want? Well, we're off by 5 orders of magnitude for what the scientist wants, and by the time we get there, the scientist will be 5 orders of magnitude ahead of us again. Forget it, it'll never happen. You'll never buy one big enough. It's not possible. So you end up with doing stuff like this. This is really hard to do. It makes for very sparse, irregular memory accesses, which is how I spend most of my life, is trying to solve that problem. These are the processes, and each one has roughly the same number of cells. Why? Because they need to run in parallel, and the slowest guy, holds everybody up. So you want to balance how many cells each one has. But guess what? The thing's moving, and it's changing, and it's drilling in here, and it's drilling out there. And so every time step, you have to redo all this memory, a petabyte, and get it all straightened back up again so that you can run it again. And this is actually a pretty trivial example, because they aren't squares, they're tetrahedrals. And it's 3D, not 2D. And the materials in there's hundreds of materials. And so there's hundreds of values in each one of these cells. We even have a hard time figuring out how to serialize this. If you wrote that out to a file, how the hell would you write it out to a file? Well, we use this thing called Hilbert space filling curves, where you can draw a line that touches everything, all the cells, and you can connect them all together and you serialize them. So guess what? We've been writing for 40 years. We've been writing big old huge files that are columnar. All the pressures, all the temperatures, all the momentums, material properties, all that crap. And we've been doing it in Hilbert order. So it's columnar in Hilbert order. It's ordered columnar data for 40 years. And 30 years after we started doing that, the Apache ecosystem was born. And they're all about columnar for lots of good reasons. Vectorize as well. Yeah, we knew that. All kinds of things, right? And so we said we should leverage this columnar technology that's in the Apache ecosystem to do all this. And this is why. And what are we trying to do? Well, it'd be neat if we could figure out and follow the yellow or the light blue, which are the edge of the eddies. That'd be cool if we could just follow that and not have to read all petabyte, that's a petabyte, and that's a petabyte, and that's a petabyte, not have to read all 10,000 petabytes to just follow the yellow and the blue, the light blue, the edge of the eddies. And so that's the goal. That's what we want to go do. And this is one example of lots of examples, but most grid methods, this is how they work. 100 state variables, 3D, all that kind of stuff. And this kind of tells you what you get out of row groups and the Apache ecosystem. You can reduce trivially entire row groups because out here, these row groups don't have anything fun going on. So you can just go, no, I don't want to look at those row groups. And then right there, you probably need the whole row group, but only a subset of the columns probably. And here, you probably need only a subset of the rows and some set of the columns to figure out where the yellow part is, right? And so, of course, again, this is crazy, stupid, simple. It really looks more like that. It's really hard to do. Anyway, this is what we're trying to accomplish. How are we going to try to do it? We're going to try to use this Apache ecosystem with all this stack. We want to do a query and say, find me where the eddy is, where's the edge of the eddy, right? And across this 10,000 petabytes. And we want to use languages like R and Python so that the new kids can program it well. And we want to use query languages in like SQL and the like, or pseudo SQL. And we want to be able to leverage things like Presto and Spark and things like that. And so we want to use all those tools because they're free and they exist and they run at scale. And so we want to do all that. So we want to be able to push the data down as Parquet files and pull the data, push the query down using a technology called Substrate, which is a way you push queries down and different layers can pick off different amounts of the query to run. And then we also want to pass the data back in a format called arrow, which all of these things understand. So how would we do that? Well, we write the data out probably in objects because objects have the ability to be whole row groups of data. You have to understand what the data is. The data has to be whole. And so we'll probably use objects or files. We can't really use blocks because we can't guarantee that we can fit a whole analytic friendly thing into a block. So we'll write the data out through a normal method, and then we'll read it back, and then we'll push a query down through, like an RPC layer. We'll go through Spark. Spark will push it down all the way to the device. The device will, through the object server, and the device will send the data back in arrow, and the devices are object-oriented NVMe devices. So we're doing object over NVMe. Guess what? This is all SPDK. For those of you that are storage developers and you know what SPDK is, this part of it is all SPDK. And I probably shouldn't take you through all the details of this, but I will say that the write side sort of just works like normal, but the read side, the query side, you push this query down, push it down to the object server. The object server runs SPDK and puts the query down on the storage device. The storage device fires up whatever accelerator it's got, goes and gets the answers that you desire from your query, and sends the data back in arrow. And so, an analytics person can be dumb. They can get to live up here and then, geez, this is Python. I'm just going to call this thing. And all this mechanism is going to happen below me. And remember, this is one path, and there's 1,000 of these paths happening in parallel, right? And so it's very, very powerful. The person gets to write a little R or a little Python, and they get all of this apparatus engaged for them. And what ends up at the top are the few records that really matter, and not all petabytes and petabytes of data. And so you do the reductions way down here close to the device. We had a bunch of partners on this. There was a demo done at Supercomputing this last year in November that's associated with this. That was done by SK Hynix. We actually funded an object server called Versity. Why did we do that? Because the MinIO gateway became deprecated. So there was no open source one. So we funded a first class object server that has plugins at the bottom, just like the MinIO gateway did, only this one's written in Go, whether you like Go or not. But it's state-of-the-art object server. It's freeware. They're very, they'll work with you, so it's kind of nice. So anyway, we had to fund that. Also, we've been working with AirMetal and NeuroBlade, which are analytics companies. What if you wanted to do this but not use object? What if you wanted to use file? Some people are file people, some people are object people. Well, it turns out that it would work pretty well. And why? There's the same stack, Presto, push down NFS, NFS client, NFS server, and store file systems down here, right? So how would you write Parquet files? Well, you'd write them through NFS. Write the Parquet files. Just write them, through that method and write them down here to this XFS that's mounted. And then how would you do the query? Well, you would run a fuse. Everybody's a storage developer in the room, and they all know what fuse is. And so you just run a fuse down here, and you export the fuse. And when you open up a path, you say, hey, path, I'm going to pass down a query to you, and I want you to run that query over these files. You can honor user permissions because NFS will pass the user information all the way down to the bottom. So essentially, this thing runs the query for you and sends back the data in Arrow so that the query can happen down here and not go back and forth between the client and the server. And that I don't have to buy a giant machine to do analytics here. It's going to be reduced down here at the NFS server or below at the storage devices. So this looks like it's pretty simple to do. Of course, we never want to do this. We want to actually do it in parallel and make this very, very wide. And how would we do that? Well, we would use PNFS. If anybody's following the NFS 4.2 saga, PNFS we funded back, 25 years ago at University of Michigan. It's nice to see that it's finally coming out, though, right? So you've got PNFS, so that you've got a PNFS metadata server. A PNFS meta server gives you location information for where the piece parts are. The piece parts are going to be Parquet files that are spread across thousands of NFS servers, across tens of thousands of devices. And PNFS will tell us where all this stuff is so that we can push these queries down to the right place to make it local. What does that make PNFS? Well, it really makes it a super version of HDFS. For those of you that don't know what HDFS is, it'll do that, plus it'll do a whole lot more. And it's, not a Java thing either, so that would be good. So anyway, we plan to do this. We'll be demonstrating this, hopefully, maybe before SDC, certainly by supercomputing. And so anyway, that's what we're up to there. I think I've already talked about all that. I will leave 5 minutes for questions. I will say that we had some really, really good partners. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about what the partners do. AirMetal is an analytics company that have an object server. They push the analytic down to their object server or below. The neat thing about their technology is they don't span objects across devices. They do their erasure across objects, not within objects, so that the object will never be spanned across more than one device, which means you can push the analytic all the way to the device because it will understand the thing. So it's pretty cool technology. Versity, I already talked about. We have an open source object gateway that anybody can use. Feel free to use it. SK Hynix helped us with a lot of stuff, the row stuff and the column stuff. Hammerspace provides a PNFS, in case you didn't know that. Aeon Computing built some hardware for us. Identicom actually wrote the wrote the offload engine for the ZFS, and NeuroBlade is that's an analytics company that has an analytics accelerator. That's a Cray 1, 1976. That's not me, but somebody was talking about core memory at breakfast. This is a CDC 6600 that had core memory in it. We had like 19 of these things, rows and rows of them, back in the 70s. Anyway, those disk drives, they hold 350 megabytes. Wow. Anyway, any questions? Yeah.
So on your NFS.
Hold on 1 second.
Oh,
I'll get it.
not that small. I'm sure people can hear me.
It's the audio.
So I guess on the NFS one, so on the object model, I get you can do the offload, right? Because the entire object's on the disk drive and you're
Yep.
loaded across all. But on the NFS one, I mean, traditionally the files, your conceptual object gets spread across all the disk drives within the NFS server. So how does the kind of offload and, the computational storage, search and part work?
In the case of, what can I say? In the case of, you're correct, but of course it's parallel, so each NFS server would be able to do, so you could parallelize this because there'll be lots of NFS servers. I don't know if you know how PNFS works.
Well, that I understood,
But you can't,
offload now runs in the NFS server and not
right,
in the endpoint?
today, right now, that's true.
Okay, that
However, that changes because I think it was just announced, the NFS committee is, with our help and money, putting erasure in the client. Yeah, and that will be able to do erasure across files as well as within them. And so you could push that all the way to devices. And so you can't today, but you will be able to a year and a half from now probably. Because the client can choose to break up and erasure any way you tell it to.
So then you don't need the protection layer.
In fact, you don't need failover pairs anymore. Yay! There's a lot of things you don't need. Of course, there's problems with how do you do erasure from the client efficiently, and we've been through this I don't know how many times. Panasys was the poster child for this, and we helped them, but they never really got it quite right. We think we know how to do it right at this point. So anyway, that's where that's headed. So your observation is right on.
I had a question about the kernel module and whether or not for the data agnostic computational storage pieces, does it match to any standards available now? And have you got other people interested in that kernel module? So gain momentum, basically, is what I'm asking.
I would say it was written not for ZFS. It was written to say, hey, send me a block and I'll erasure it for you, and tell me how you want to erasure, or send me a block and, or I can register for this. So that particular kernel module could be used by any storage system. Is anybody else using it? I don't know. Have we gone to a lot of trouble to try to figure out how to get people to use it? No. But it's kind of just a registration system. Right? It's not really a send data to me. It's a I do erasure really well. Here's how you use me. But it doesn't. But the data doesn't flow through that mechanism. That part is inside of the file system code in the kernel. So I don't know why it couldn't be used for that, because it's kind of just a registration system and for kernel things that want to do erasure, encoding, whatever thing you want to do, dedupe, whatever it is. Not a very good answer, but yeah.
On your slide where you were showing object stack with NVMe and NVMe over Fabric at the bottom, what are you using as the select criteria there? How are you doing select it's essentially a map phase, right? So
Right. So the way that works is the select actually occurs way up here. The user got some Python, puts a select in it, sends it to Presto or Spark or any of those query engines that exist. There's a bunch. The gory detail is that Presto then goes to a Hive database and looks up which files are associated with this schema. So when you do queries, you don't put files in there, you put tables in there. So you need something to map from table to file or files. So that's done through a Hive database. This is actually standard. We didn't write any of this. This is how analytics work in Apache. So you get the list of files that way. Then there's a plugin that goes into Presto that's being written now by NeuroBlade that takes the file list from Hive and takes the SQL, and they pass that and they turn it into Substrate. Substrate is essentially a way to take SQL, and there's like, 19 variants of SQL now because the world's gotten big, it turns it into an execution graph. So every SQL maps into this just simple graph of how you execute predicates and sorts and sort by, and group bys and all the crap you can do. So it gets stuffed into this substrate format, and it gets written down through RPC through to a daemon running on the object server. So it doesn't go through the object path. You can do selects in object, but it's crappy. You can only do one predicate. It's barely usable. This is a full-blown thing, so anything that Presto could do can turn into Substrate. Substrate would write the stuff down through this RPC client to an RPC server. The RPC server unscrews it passes the substrate to the devices, and the substrate and through SPDK, through a sort of a new command in SPDK, and these devices decide what to pick off. That's how substrate works. So you push it all the way to the bottom, and then the devices will go, I can do this predicate, and I can do that predicate, and I can do the sort, and whatever. And so they pull this stuff off the graph and pass it back up the chain. And once it's clear to the top, everybody knows who's running what, over what data. And oftentimes the sort or the group by has to run clear up here, because its scope is over all the data, where these things don't have all the data, right? And so that's how it works. And this is all this does is pass this stuff through, turns RPC into SPDK more or less, and writes the stuff through. So there's an SPDK for sending the select down, and then the query. These things run the query, and if they pick stuff off like a predicate, they send the answer back in arrow, and this thing just reflects the arrow back. An arrow is this data frame format for moving data, where Parquet is this columnar format for storing data. I don't know if I answered your question, though.
There's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on.
But I think I get it.
Yeah, and it's actually a lot simpler in NFS because you're just opening up a handle, open up, file something on that path, /pushdown/Gary's file. That thing doesn't exist. It's just a fuse daemon that's running that says, oh, Gary, I know him. I know what his UID is, all the junk about him, right? And he's wanting me to do something. I'm going to give him a handle back, and he's going to pass me down an SQL substrate thing. And I'm going to unscrew it, this fuse daemon, and I'm going to do the right things with substrate, do the query myself or push it down the devices or whatever, and get the answers back, and the answer is going to flow back on that same file handle. So this guy, all he did was wrote an SQL thing down through an NFS handle to a fuse daemon, and then the answers were extracted and pushed up that same handle to the client, and the client just reads the stuff back in arrow. So it's super simple in NFS. Yep, that's how analytics streams work. They're arrow streams. You can have many arrow streams and all this stuff, but we didn't have to do any of that. That all came from Apache.
Thank you, Gary.
Sure.
Everyone, let's thank Gary.